Hello folks, I'm Alex, this is Alex Unabridged, and today it's time to give you my thoughts on The Drowned World by J.G. Ballard. So welcome back to the channel if that is the case. Yes, time for another kind of my thoughts on review type video on the next one in my science fiction for the somewhat hesitant project. The project which allows me to explore some classic science fiction as a noob. And today it's the turn of The Drowned World by J.G. Ballard. So this one is a sort of post-apocalyptic novel that explores a future version of Earth which has been kind of devastated by solar radiation. I think it's kind of solar flares essentially have caused like massive increase in radiation, which has melted the polar ice caps, raising the sea levels, and essentially turned the planet into a series of lagoons, like completely covering cities. The temperatures near the equator are intolerable, and even sort of in northern climes are becoming intolerable quickly. And so this is centered in London, and London is now a tropical lagoon, or a series of tropical lagoons, populated by lizards and bats and insects, all of which are kind of huge. They've got bigger in size, and they're essentially regressing backwards towards what they were in the Triassic period. So they're kind of almost becoming dinosaurs, and there is kind of like talk of a potential dinosaur type creature swimming through lagoons. And the story follows primarily a biologist called Dr. Robert Kerrans, who is part of a scientific team sort of accompanied by military, I think UN, who is there in London studying the flora and fauna of this new world. But Kerrans and a couple of the other characters as well in this start to dream about sort of this strange primordial world, and these dreams kind of cause a psychological transformation that kind of helps them adapt to this new environment, but also kind of makes him unsuitable, if you like, at odds with the modern world, which is suggesting a similar kind of evolutionary regression for humans as you're getting with the animals, but this one's more psychological. So as the sun's radiation increases and even London starts to become intolerable, this team receives orders to retreat back to the Arctic. But Kerrans and another couple of these characters who've been having these dreams decide to stay behind, feeling this really powerful connection to this new, but at the same time, ancient world. There they stay in isolation for a while, kind of seemingly almost quite reflective. And then a strange and rather theatrical character called Strangman, or Strangeman, I'm not sure how you pronounce it. Strangeman would be applicable because he's quite strange, who is a looter and a scavenger, and generally not a very nice guy. He arrives with his band of looters and army of crocodiles to disrupt the isolation, and conflict arises between Strangman or Strangeman and Kerrans and his little band of survivors. So that's the basic premise for you there on this one. So what did I think of it then? I enjoyed this a lot on the whole. So I'm going to give you the good, the middling and the bad. And then we'll go through the broken down review rating at the end. So we'll start with the goods then. Two major highs for me: the atmosphere and setting, and Ballard's prose, the writing. The prose is masterful in parts. Through most of it, to be fair, it's precise. It's quite, it's not purple, but it's really evocative. The imagery in it is outstanding. It's It maybe sometimes wanders a little into the pretentious, maybe a little bit dramatic at times, but I can kind of forgive it that for the incredible descriptive qualities that it has. And this is no more kind of evident for me when he's talking about the environment and the setting. I've got a couple of quotes that I will read out for you because these really speak to that. So the first one is quite a long one, but this gives you a good idea of sort of the setting, in London, what it's like. As they moved along through the flat water, the sun slanting down behind them, opening up the submerged depths, they could see the clear outlines of 5- and 6-story buildings looming like giant ghosts, here and there a moss-covered roof breaking the surface as the swell rolled past it. 60 feet below the cutter, a straight grey promenade stretched away between the buildings, the remains of some former thoroughfare, the rusting humped shells of cars still standing by the curb. Many of the lagoons in the centre of the city were surrounded by an intact ring of buildings, and consequently little silt had entered them. Free of vegetation, apart from a few drifting clumps of sargasso weed, the streets and shops had been preserved almost intact, like a reflection in a lake that had somehow lost its original. The bulk of the city had long since vanished, and only the steel-supported buildings of the central commercial and financial areas had survived the encroaching floodwaters. The brick houses and single-storied factories of the suburbs had disappeared completely below the drifting tides of silt. Where these broke surface, giant forests reared up into the burning dull green sky, smothering the former wheat fields of temperate Europe and North America. Impenetrable Mato Grossos, sometimes 300 feet high, they were a nightmare world of competing organic forms returning rapidly to their Paleozoic past, and the only avenues of transit for the United Nations military units were through the lagoon systems that had superimposed themselves on the former cities. But even these were now being clogged with silt and then submerged. So yeah, like the idea of these cities, most of the city still being visible under the water, and as they drive along on these boats, as they go through these lagoons, all the streets are still there, like frozen, almost frozen in time. It's a really quite an eerie feeling, an eerie setting. And then you've got the creatures that inhabit as well. So you've got, this kind of very eerie, almost abandoned feeling to these cities, but they're not abandoned. They're teeming with life. It's just not human life anymore. And there's a threat that comes with that. Screeching like a dispossessed banshee, a large hammer-nosed bat roared straight out of one of the narrow inlets off the creek and swerved straight towards the cutter. Its sonar, confused by the labyrinth of giant webs spun by the inlet by the colonies of wolf spiders, it missed the wire hood above Keren's head only by a few feet, and then sailed away along the line of a submerged office block, gliding in and out of the huge sail-like fronds of the fern trees sprouting from their roofs. Suddenly, as it passed one of the projecting cornices, a motionless stone-headed creature snapped out and plucked the bat from the air. There was a brief piercing squawk, and Keren's caught a glimpse of the crushed wings clamped in the lizard's jaws. Then the reptile shrank back invisibly amongst the foliage. So yeah, there's these like iguanas everywhere that, are a threat. They're big and they will go for you. There are bats, there are spiders, later on you've got crocodiles. It's this very strange mix of a kind of a deserted human civilization and this like intense, inhospitable, hostile jungle environment. It's a really, really interesting setting, and it's the way that Ballard, for me, evokes not only the sense of place and environment, but also the emotion connected to it. There's a section later on where Keren's dives in a suit. This is when Strangeman's there. Dives in a suit down and goes inside the abandoned London Planetarium. And that is a really effectively written section in terms of how it affects Keren's as well. looking up at what at the kind of the star map essentially in the planetarium that's kind of still just visible, and what that kind of does to him in terms of his psychology. Another thing that I really appreciated in this as well is the ideas, some of the ideas in it, the themes, things like that. So obviously there's going to be themes of human survival and adaptability. This is a human world which is now gone. Humans are having to find other places to live, but also kind of figure out whether they can ever get this back, study the new flora and fauna, try to make sense of this new world. But also the idea of, for me, particularly the idea of this kind of evolutionary psychological regression that Keren's and those that dream, his kind of the other couple of characters that stay behind with him after the army pulls out, who are Bodkin, a fellow scientist, and Beatrice, who was a resident of the submerged London, who the team met whilst they were researching there. The way that these dreams affect their psychology is really interesting. Again, I've got another quote for that. These are the oldest memories on Earth, the time codes carried in every chromosome and gene. Every step we've taken in our evolution is a milestone inscribed with organic memories. From the enzymes controlling the carbon dioxide cycle to the organisation of the brachial plexus and the nerve pathways of the pyramid cells in the midbrain, each is a record of 1,000 decisions taken in the face of a sudden physico-chemical crisis. Just as psychoanalysis reconstructs the original traumatic situation in order to release the repressed material, so we are now being plunged back into the archaeopsychic past, uncovering the ancient taboos and drives that have been dormant for epochs. The brief span of an individual life is misleading. Each one of us is as old as the entire biological kingdom, and our bloodstreams are tributaries of the great sea of its total memory. The uterine odyssey of the growing fetus recapitulates the entire evolutionary past, and its central nervous system is a coded timescale, each nexus of neurons and each spinal level marking a symbolic station, a unit of neuronic time. The sciencey elements of this, like with regards to this idea of neuronic time, archaeopsychology, kind of deep time, this time sickness, I find that stuff fascinating. I think, anybody who's watched the channel for a bit will know that I've mentioned deep time, the concept of deep time, things like that before, is something that fascinates me. And this kind of brings it into, kind of psychology and sort of human, evolution or de-evolution or whatever, whatever you want to call it. Yeah, that sort of stuff kind of really, that's the sort of stuff that just sets my mind off, like wandering and wondering. So I really appreciated that kind of stuff. Okay, the middling stuff then, the stuff that was okay but not so great. Characters in this are very meh. There's not a huge amount of development for them. It's a bit hand wavy, for want of a better term. They're all serviceable enough for what they're there for. There's quite a lot of symbolism in this. I think everything is potentially like a symbol. I think it's quite evident. And the characters, I think, are no different. They are symbols for things. But there's still, there's just not very much there in terms of character development. And somebody like Strangeman is a very over the top, very stereotypical villain. There's, as I say, they're okay, they're serviceable, but there's no major depth there to them. And the same can be said for the plot. It's thin. It's wandering. It wanders around quite a lot. I was never really sure where it was gonna go in the end, and not necessarily in that kind of cool, it's a mystery kind of way. More in just that it felt quite unfocused at times. It didn't drag at any point. It was a very compelling read. But I do think that this could have been a bit shorter. I think maybe a novella length would have been better for it. there was certainly some bits which I think you could do without. As I say, it didn't affect me in terms of the pacing or anything, but it just wandered a lot. So those are the two things that I think, yeah, they're fine, but they're middling. The bad. You've only got one female character in it, and it's a typically kind of poor representation of women for the era in which it was written. This is 1962, I think. But the major thing for me, which I found difficult to overlook and is worth mentioning, is the amount of problematic language and depictions when it comes to Strangeman's band of looters. Strangeman himself is white, but his kind of gang, his band of looters, are all men of colour. And the way that they are written is not good. There are racial stereotypes aplenty. Plus the language used to describe them, their ethnicity, etc., is wholly inappropriate by today's standards. With books of this age, I can deal with a certain amount of outdated language, the odd word usage, which was deemed all right at the time, even though it's, clearly wholly unacceptable now. I can put down to just it's of the time, and I don't like it, but I can take it, I can note it that it's part of the historical and cultural context of when the book was written. If you're going to read older works, you're going to find language and views, etc., in them that are outdated. This is not the first time it's happened. It won't be the last. But there was more stuff in here than I've come across in previous books. As I say, especially in terms of the depictions of this band of looters. But yeah, it's worth noting for me that actually on this occasion, there was enough of it to really jar for me that it did affect my enjoyment of it by the end of it. Okie dokes, so to a score then. I will pop the breakdown of the scores up on screen. Character, we've got a 6, which is kind of mediocre, it's fine, Atmosphere is a 10, absolutely. It's one of the best books I've read, certainly in the last couple of years, in terms of the setting, the atmosphere, evoking that. And that always is an important factor for me in a book, because I need to be able to visualise and feel in it. And it really did work in this. Writing is a 9. I really like Ballard's prose style. As I say, it's direct, it's precise, it's not overly flowery, but it's extremely evocative. The plot is another 6. It's fine. Ideas, I've given it an 8. As I say, there's a lot of stuff about adaptability, survival, even sort of sense of self, individuality, regression, and all this stuff about archaeopsychology and time, deep time, all that kind of stuff. I went nuts with that. I always do. 8 for that one. And then the enjoyment factor is a 7. It was a good, but that would have probably been a couple of points higher had I not had that stuff, the problematic stuff, jar for me. To be honest, it's like, as I say, it did affect it for me in this. That's a personal reaction to it. Your mileage may vary, but yeah, for me, it was enough to knock it down a couple of points. Okay, so adding all of those up then and dividing by 6, we get a score of 7.67. I will round that down to 7.5 out of 10. And this will go on Storygraph at a 3.5 to a 4-star. I'm not entirely sure which yet. I'm still mulling on that. So yes. But generally, overall, enjoyed it a lot, with those caveats that I've mentioned. I will read more Ballard. This is one of several of his works, earlier works, that explores climate apocalypses. What's the plural for apocalypse? I never know. Explores the end of the world thanks to climate, basically. I think the Wind from Nowhere and the Burning World are the other two. I'm not sure. There's the Crystal World, but I don't know whether that's part of this. I don't think so. But let me know if you know different. But yeah, given the prose style that I enjoyed so much and the atmosphere in the Drowned Mill, I definitely want to give those a go for sure. And I really like the sound of High Rise as well. I hear really, really good reports of High Rise, which is a little bit later on. That's into the mid-70s. So yeah, I'll definitely return to Ballard at a later date. That reading of this one marks the end of the first block of classic science fiction for this project of mine, this Science Fiction for the Somewhat Hesitant project. May is an interlude month, so I've got a couple of YA science fiction books to read. I've got The White Mountains by John Christopher, which is the first in the Tripods trilogy, and The Fifth Wave as well by Rick Yancey, so a bit more of a modern one. So a bit of a less taxing month potentially on the old brain. Not quite so heavy with the ideas, I guess, in those. At least not the sort of stuff that's going to, kind of melt my brain thinking about it. So yes, those are May's, and then we'll be back into some more classic stuff and some new age stuff in block 2 in June, which is great books, great movies. So I'll have some movies to watch as well once I've read the books, and that I am extremely excited for. But I will leave it there. I will leave it there for today, folks. Thank you very much for watching, as always. Do leave your thoughts in the comments below. Let me know if you've read more Ballard, and if you've got a favourite, another one that you think I might like, then do let me know. I will be back on Sunday with a chat about a couple of Grady Hendrix books that I've read in April, so that I hope you will join me for that then. But from me, for now, that's ta-ra.